In the hot summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds in the wet bayous of southern Louisiana. Not because of yellow fever or consumption. While he slept, each one had his throat cut open with surgical precision. Their bodies were found at dawn with looks that were stuck between happiness and fear. All 11 were well-known members of the Knights of the White Camellia, which was the most feared chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in the area. Local officials wrote reports that said the deaths were unrelated events that happened in 4 parishes. These reports went against witness statements and physical evidence. The case was quietly closed after 6 months, and the parish judge ordered all records to be sealed. But in the small rooms of the colored sections and the back rooms of freedmen's churches, another story was going around. This story would be whispered for generations, never written down, and never spoken out loud where white people could hear it. Finally, that story can be told tonight. Before we go on with the story of the woman they called Lauve Noire, I need you to do something for me. Hit the subscribe button right now, because this channel is all about uncovering stories like this one, stories that powerful men wanted to forget and that were buried on purpose. And please let me know in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you hearing this from the Deep South, like Louisiana? I want to know where in our community people are seeing these long-lost histories come to light. The story doesn't start in 1872. It starts 4 years earlier, in the ashes of a war that was supposed to be over. In 1868, Street Martin Parish was a wound that wouldn't heal. The big plantations that used to grow tons of sugar and cotton now looked like rotting teeth against the Louisiana sky. Their fields were turning back into swamps, and federal troops were living in their manor houses or letting them fall down under the weight of their own former glory. Breaux Bridge was the parish seat. It was a group of weathered buildings around a courthouse that had changed flags 3 times in 7 years. The old planter class was scared by how the population had changed. Almost 4,000 former slaves were now free to walk around in streets where they had once been told not to even look white people in the eye. Some of them owned land. They voted, and Union soldiers and the Freedmen's Bureau kept them safe. They testified against white defendants in court, which was so against the natural order that many longtime residents called it an apocalypse, the end of civilization itself. As a result, the Knights of the White Camellia came together from the ashes of Confederate veteran groups and local militias. The Louisiana Knights were proud of how sophisticated they were compared to their more famous counterparts in other states. They didn't wear hoods or burn crosses. They were lawyers, merchants, former officers, and plantation owners who were trying to save what was left of their businesses. They were in charge of the local courts, the sheriff's office, and the parish council. They didn't need to put on a show. They had power. Their plans were precise. If a freedman spoke too freely in town, his crops might be burned, his mule might be hamstrung, and his credit at the general store might be taken away. A man of color who registered to vote might get a visit at night from well-dressed men who politely told him why he should think about it again. Violence was only used on people who wouldn't listen. And even then, it was planned to send a message without getting the federal government involved. Every Thursday night, the Knights met in a back room of the Breaux Bridge Hotel, a 3-story hotel on Main Street owned by Harold Jessup, one of the Knights' founding members. There were 11 men in the inner circle. They made the decisions about which freedmen needed to be reminded of their place, which white Republicans needed to be pushed to leave the parish, and which federal sympathizers needed to be pushed harder. A woman named Celeste Dufresne walked into this powder keg. On a Tuesday morning in late April, she got off the steamboat from New Orleans in Breaux Bridge with just one trunk and a black silk parasol. She looked to be about 30 years old, but her face had a quality that made it hard to tell her age. She wasn't young or old. She was somehow outside the normal flow of time. Her skin was the color of café au lait, which is a color that can mean anything from Creole aristocracy to mixed parentage from a dozen different places in Louisiana. She wore expensive mourning clothes that needed a skilled seamstress and fine fabric to make, which showed her wealth and status. She paid for a room at the Breaux Bridge Hotel a month in advance, with gold coins that she counted out one by one on Harold Jessup's front desk. Her French was perfect, and her English had a Parisian accent that the locals found interesting. She said she was the widow of a French merchant who died in New Orleans during the yellow fever outbreak of the summer before last. She said she was looking to buy land in the parish, maybe a small house with land where she could live peacefully away from the disease and chaos of the city. The story made sense. New Orleans had really been hit hard by an epidemic. French traders did business all over Louisiana. Well-bred Creole widows often went to live in smaller towns to get away from it all. There was something about Celeste Dufresne that made people not want to ask her too many questions. She had a dignity and self-control that made it seem like she was used to being treated with respect. Every Sunday morning, she went to Mass at St. Bernard Catholic Church and sat in the section set aside for Creole families of standing. She ate in the hotel dining room by herself every day, reading French novels or writing letters in a neat, precise hand. She walked around town in the afternoons with a parasol over her face, nodding politely to people she passed but not starting any conversations. She didn't seem to care about the racial tensions that were tearing the parish apart. She didn't have any political views or ties to either the freedmen's community or the federal government. In less than 2 weeks, she had every man on the Knights Council's attention. It all started out fine. Thomas Broussard, who owned 1,500 acres of cotton fields east of town that weren't doing well, ran into her outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon. She was looking at a piece of fabric and moving her gloved hands over it with skill. He said he would help. He said he knew the merchant and could make sure she got a fair price. She smiled at him, and it looked like she was both thankful and a little amused, as if she thought his chivalry was sweet but not needed. They talked for about 10 minutes. During that time, she talked about how hard it was for her to find a good place to live, how she didn't know much about the area, and how she was relying on the kindness of strangers during this hard time of mourning. Broussard thought about her all day. There was something about her that drew him in, but he couldn't put his finger on it. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just that. It was a kind of focused attention that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered when she looked at you. He felt the touch like an electric current when she lightly touched his arm and thanked him for his help. He started looking for excuses to be in the hotel lobby when she walked by. He said he would show her homes that might work for her. She said yes, with a humility that seemed to show that she understood both his kindness and her own vulnerable position as a woman alone. Over the next few days, they rode out to several parcels, always with someone else nearby to keep an eye on them, and always finished before sunset. Broussard told his wife that these were possible business deals and that he was helping a good widow like any Christian man would. But he couldn't stop thinking about Celeste. How the candlelight caught the curve of her neck, how her clothes smelled like lavender, and how her eyes sometimes looked at him with an expression that seemed to see through all of his careful respectability to something raw and hungry beneath. The other Knights saw that Broussard was distracted, and over time, a few of them started to get to know Madame Dufresne. Antoine Lair, a lawyer who had defended a number of Klan members in federal court, said he would help her with property transfers if she needed it. Dr. Raymond Heber, the parish coroner, was worried about her health, the stress of being a widow, and the change in climate. He suggested that she might benefit from a consultation. Eugene Fontenot, who owned the parish's biggest dry goods store, gave her a generous line of credit for anything she might need for her home once she found it. Celeste politely turned down every offer, never seeming to want attention, but somehow making each man feel like he was the only one who understood her situation and could give her what she needed. They told themselves that she was a good woman who was going through a tough time. Their interest was only polite. It was only natural for them to think about her, to come up with reasons to go to the hotel, and to compare her refined ways to their wives' more simple ones. By June, the way the Knights interacted during their Thursday meetings had changed in small ways. The 11 men who had always worked together like soldiers now had small rivalries and competitions for status and standing. Broussard talked about how he and Madame Dufresne would drive around in the afternoon. Lair fought back with his legal advice. Hebert talked about her weak health and how she needed to see a doctor on a regular basis. Jessup, the hotel owner, Marcos Thibodeau, who ran the parish newspaper, Judge Vincent Theo, who ran the local courts, Sheriff Claude Deveau, banker Phipe Rousseau, plantation owners William Duplantis and Charles Arsenault. Each found their own way to get to know the interesting widow. None of them realized that Celeste had never really bought any property. No one asked why a woman who was supposedly running away from New Orleans would choose Breaux Bridge, a violent backwater torn apart by racial conflict. No one thought it was strange that she seemed so calm for a grieving widow. She never cried or talked about her dead husband in any clear way. And none of them knew that Celeste Dufresne sat at the small desk in her room late at night, when the hotel was quiet, and wrote down notes in a leather-bound journal. She wrote down each man's habits, weaknesses, secrets, sins, where he lived, who guarded his house, whether his wife slept soundly, whether he kept weapons near his bed, and everything else she would need to know when it was time to collect her debts. Celeste Dufresne, if that was even her real name, didn't come to Breaux Bridge to buy a house, mourn her husband, or get away from yellow fever. She had come for a very specific reason that required her to be patient, plan ahead, and be ready to use every weapon she had. She had come to kill 11 men. The first death happened on the 19th of July, 1872, during the hottest heat wave anyone in Street Martin Parish could remember. At dawn, Thomas Broussard's wife found his body. He was lying in their bed in the plantation house his father had given him. The cut was so deep that it almost reached his spine, and it opened his throat from ear to ear. The sheets, mattress, and floor next to the bed were all soaked with blood. His face was calm, but the wound was very violent. His eyes were closed, his face was calm, and his hands were at his sides, as if he had just fallen asleep and never woken up. The staff came running when Mrs. Broussard screamed. One of them was an old black woman named Esther, who had worked for the family since before the war, first as a slave and now as a paid servant. Years later, Esther would talk about what she saw when she walked into that bedroom, but her testimony would never be put in official records. Not just the body or the blood, but something else that didn't make sense, and she knew right away that she should never tell white people about it. There were 2 empty wine glasses on the nightstand. The room smelled like lavender and something else, something sweet and natural that Esther couldn't put her finger on. Mr. Broussard was only wearing his nightshirt, which was bunched up around his thighs. The bedclothes were messed up in a way that made it look like there had been a lot of activity before death. Mrs. Broussard had been sleeping in a bedroom next door because she had trouble sleeping and often took separate rooms to avoid waking her husband. However, there was clear evidence that Broussard was not alone when he died. Within an hour, Sheriff Devo and Dr. Hebert were there. They looked around the house, talked to the servants, and came up with the official story. Thomas Broussard was killed by an intruder, probably a freedman with a grudge, who snuck into the house at night and cut his throat while he slept. The fact that there were no signs of a struggle made it seem like the killer was quick and skilled. Nothing had been stolen, which meant that this was personal and not a robbery. The sheriff thought it might have been revenge for one of the many warnings the Knights had given to uppity black people in the last few months. But Esther found something that the white man had missed or chosen to ignore when she cleaned the room after the body was taken away. There was a single, long, dark, and shiny hair caught in the floorboards near the bed. It was too fine to be Mrs. Broussard's. She found more than just blood on the sheets when she took them off. There were other fluids there, proof of things that good people didn't talk about, but that every woman knew about. She didn't say anything. She did what Mrs. Broussard told her to do and burned the sheets. She cleaned the floors, scrubbed the bloodstains, and opened the windows to let in the smell of death and secrets. And when the other servants asked her what she'd seen, she told them only what would keep them safe, that Mr. Broussard had been killed by an intruder, that the sheriff was investigating, that they should all be careful not to go out alone at night. But in the colored part of town, where people had learned to see what white people didn't want to see, a different story started to spread. It was about the beautiful widow who had just moved to town and caught the attention of many important men. It was also about Thomas Broussard's frequent visits to the hotel, how he looked at Madame Dufresne, the afternoons he spent showing her properties that he never seemed to mention to his wife, and how convenient it was that a man known for being cruel to freedmen had his throat cut just days after being seen having dinner with the mysterious Creole widow. The whole town came out to pay their respects at the funeral on a Saturday. The Knights came as a group and stood together near the grave, looking serious. These men were not stupid. They knew that killing one of their own was a message and a declaration of war. They thought it came from the freedmen's community or people who were sympathetic to the government. They talked quietly about how to react, what steps to take, and which colored leaders should be punished. No one noticed that Celeste Dufresne was also at the funeral. She stood at a respectful distance, wearing a black veil and bowing her head as if she were praying. None of them saw the small, satisfied smile on her lips when she thought no one was watching. And none of them knew that there would be another funeral in 3 weeks. Antoine died on August 9th, and the way he died was very similar to the way Broussard died. He was found dead in his bachelor quarters above his law office. His throat was cut, his face was calm, and there was evidence that a woman had been with him shortly before he died. This time, the people in charge of the investigation, what was left of them, since the sheriff and coroner were also knights, couldn't keep up the story of a random intruder. 2 knights died in the same way within a month, which made it look like a pattern or a targeted campaign. The rumors in the colored community got louder. They now called her L'Ave Noire, the Black Widow, the woman who lured rich white men to bed and then killed them. Some people were afraid of her and thought she would punish all the freedmen. Others spoke with a grim sense of satisfaction, as if they were getting justice through other means when it wasn't being done through official channels. The thing that white officials wouldn't admit, and that every colored person in Street, Martin Parish knew without being told, was that Celeste Dufresne had not chosen her victims at random. Every man she seduced and every man she killed had blood on his hands. Blood that is real, not just a metaphor. They had all been involved in violence against freedmen and their families. Thomas Broussard had overseen many whippings and had set fire to the cabin of a freedman who had complained to the Freedmen's Bureau. Antoine had defended Klan members in court by scaring off witnesses of color, threatening their families, and making sure that justice was never served. The pattern would continue with each new victim, but white authorities would never connect the dots or ask why these men were chosen. The other 9 knights had an emergency meeting in the back room of the hotel on August 12. The Thursday night meetings weren't enough anymore. The situation called for quick action. They needed to find out who killed them. They had to keep themselves safe. They had to put things back in order before panic spread through the white community. Judge Theod was the first to say what many of them had been thinking but were too afraid to say out loud. "Guys," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "we need to think about the possibility that the killer is someone we know, someone who can get into these men's homes, and someone they trusted enough to let their guard down." No one spoke. Everyone got the hint. Broussard and Lair had been killed in their own beds, probably without a fight, and after having sex. They had to let the killer into their private space, and they couldn't be scared by the person's presence. "A woman," Dr. Hebert said softly. "It would have to be a woman." They looked at each other in horror as the pieces fell into place. A lovely woman who just moved to town. A woman who, in some way, had caught the eye of every man in the room. A woman whose background was strangely unclear, based only on her own testimony and the fact that her story made sense. Sheriff Devo said, "Madame Dufresne. Dear God, it's Madame Dufresne." But even as they came to this conclusion and started talking about how to look into her, how to prove her guilt, and how to arrest her without causing a scandal, they had a huge problem. They had all been alone with her at some point. In ways they hadn't even told themselves, each of them had been seduced by her. They all had secrets they didn't want to get out, like going to her hotel room, giving her gifts, and making promises. If they looked into her, they would have to look into themselves, which would be too much trouble for them. And underneath their fear and anger was another current that none of them would admit to: fascination. Even now, even though they knew what she might be and what she might have done, a lot of them couldn't stop thinking about her. They couldn't stop remembering how she looked at them, touched them, and made them feel like powerful men instead of bitter remnants of a dying world. Before we go further into this dark tale, I need you to understand something. This story is getting deeper and more twisted than anything you've heard before. If you're getting goosebumps and wondering how far this went, you need to hit that like button right now. Leave a comment with your guess about what will happen next. If you haven't already, please sign up now, because we're about to tell you how this game of death went down, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Let's move on. The investigation into Celeste Dufresne started off very carefully. Judge Thiot used his power to quietly ask New Orleans for information. He sent telegrams to police contacts and courthouse clerks asking about a Creole widow named Dufresne whose husband was said to have died in the yellow fever outbreak. The answers that came were worrying. During the epidemic, no merchant named Dufresne died in New Orleans. There was no death certificate for anyone who fit that description. Celeste's New Orleans address was a boarding house, and the owner didn't remember anyone named Dufresne. It was as if the woman had come out of nowhere, with no real past. At the same time, Sheriff Devo started quietly asking hotel staff and shopkeepers questions. What he learned made it seem like the woman was both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She went to church, bought normal things for her home, and kept regular hours, but no one could say they really knew her. The only people who came to see her were the knights who had called on her. She had no friends, no confidants, and no visitors. People found it hard to put into words what it was about her that made them uneasy. She was always tidy and behaved properly, but there was something about her that made them feel uneasy. The colored workers at the hotel were more helpful, but only when they were asked in private and promised safety. Rachel, a maid, said that Madame Dufresne's room had no personal items other than the basics. No letters, no photographs, no mementos of her dead husband. Just clothes, toiletries, and a locked trunk that she never saw opened. It smelled like lavender in the room all the time, even when the lady wasn't there. It was as if she had infused the walls with her scent. Rachel had seen Madame Dufresne come back to the hotel very late at night, after midnight, through a side door, and move through the hallways like a shadow. She had a leather medical bag with her both times, but Rachel couldn't think of any reason why a widow would need such things. The Knights put security measures in place while the investigation was going on. People who had families sent them to relatives in other parishes, saying they had to for business. People who lived alone hired guards, who were former Confederate soldiers who patrolled their properties at night. They changed their routines, changed the locks on their doors, and kept loaded guns close by. They didn't go out at night anymore, unless they were with other people. They were suspicious of every sound and shadow, and they waited for the next death, because they all knew it was coming. Dr. Raymond Hebert was the third person to die. He was found in his medical office on August 27th with his throat cut and his body lying on his own examination table. The situation was almost the same. There were signs of female company, wine glasses were present, and he had the same calm look on his face that he did when he died. But this murder had something new that made the survivor's blood run cold. A small piece of paper was stuck to Dr. Hebert's chest with a surgical pin. 2 words, "Remember Baton Rouge," were written in an elegant hand on it. The Knights knew right away what the message meant, but the local government and newspapers never would. Dr. Hebert went to Baton Rouge in March 1868 to testify in a federal investigation into Klan violence. A black woman named Sarah Boudreaux said that a group of white men, including Knights from Street Martin Parish, attacked her husband and set their house on fire. Dr. Hebert had said that Sarah's husband died not from injuries caused by the attackers, but from health problems he already had. This lie helped the men who were accused go free. 3 months later, Sarah Boudreaux was found dead in a rooming house in New Orleans. Her throat had been cut. Robbery was the official reason for the crime, even though nothing was stolen. It was clear from the note that Celeste knew about what happened. It also hinted at a connection to it, a personal stake in seeing Dr. Hebert punished for what he did. But how could she be sure? How could a Creole widow from New Orleans know so much about what the Klan was doing in Baton Rouge 4 years before? The answer came from a place you wouldn't expect. Judge Thiot looked at old newspaper articles and court records and found out that Sarah Boudreaux was not alone when she died. She had a daughter who was about 12 years old at the time. After her mother was killed, the girl went missing. There was no record of what happened to the girl. She had just disappeared into the chaos of Louisiana after the war, just another lost child among thousands. The judge told the Knights about this at their next meeting, which was on a Tuesday night at Jessup's Hotel. They moved the meeting from their usual Thursday time in an effort to break up any patterns. He told them when it happened. Sarah Boudreau was killed in 1868. Her daughter went missing. And now, 4 years later, a strange woman shows up in Brobridge and starts killing the men who were responsible for that murder and the larger campaign of terror against freedmen. She's the daughter, Jessup said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. God, she's Sarah Boudreau's daughter back for revenge. But there were problems with that theory. Celeste looked to be in her 30s, which was way too old to be the girl who went missing in 1868. Unless her entire appearance was a carefully constructed fiction. Her age and background and identity, all lies designed to gain access to her targets. Unless she had spent 4 years planning this campaign, finding out who was responsible, following them to their current locations, and getting ready for the part she had to play. The theory's effects on race bothered them even more. If Celeste was Sarah Boudreau's daughter, she was colored, even though her skin was light and she had a refined way of speaking. She had passed as Creole, which meant she was white enough to move through their society without anyone being suspicious. Every man she had sex with had broken Louisiana law, which still saw interracial sex as a crime and a moral stain. Even if they survived her revenge, the scandal would ruin them. Sheriff Devo said, "We need to take her now. Tonight. Get her before she kills again." But Judge Theot shook his head. "On what charge? We don't have any proof." The notes can't be used as evidence without showing what they mean. Our own investigation is compromised because we've all been involved with her. A trial would reveal everything we've tried to hide. Then we don't have a trial, Marcus Thibodeau said in a low voice. The editor of the newspaper hadn't said anything until now, but it was clear what he meant. We deal with this the same way we deal with other problems, quietly and for good. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. They were talking about murder, lynching, and the killing of a woman who had not been found guilty of any crime. It was the same thing they had done to many freedmen over the years. It was the same thing they had done to Sarah Boudreau. They all saw the irony, but their fear was stronger than any moral doubts. They voted, which they always did, when something was important. 9 men were still part of the night's inner circle. 9 hands went up in agreement. They would kill Celeste Dufresne before she could kill again. But while they were making plans, none of them noticed that Marie, a young black woman who worked as a waitress at the hotel and was cleaning glasses in the hallway, could hear everything they said through the thin walls of the meeting room. And none of them saw her slip away into the night, moving quickly toward the colored section of town, toward a small church where certain people gathered. People who had learned long ago that their survival depended on knowing what white folks planned before those plans could be enacted. By morning, everyone in the freedmen's community knew that the Knights wanted to kill Lauve Noir. And through ways that white authorities had never understood and never would, a message was sent to the hotel, to room 7, where a widow in mourning clothes sat at a small desk, writing in her leather journal. Celeste read the message, which was written on brown paper in a single line, and smiled. She knew this would happen. She had even planned for it. People could be counted on when they were angry or wanted revenge. The Knights thought they were hunting her, but they didn't know the most important thing. She had been hunting them since the moment she got there, and the hunt was far from over. She put her few things in her trunk and paid her bill at the hotel desk by mid-morning. She told him that she had heard from work that she needed to go back to New Orleans, thanked him for his hospitality, and made arrangements for her trunk to be taken to the steamboat dock. By noon, Celeste Dufresne had left Brobridge, boarding a steamboat headed south. The Knights, when they learned of her departure that evening, felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She had gotten away, but at least she was gone. At least the murders would stop. They had no way of knowing that the woman on the steamboat was not Celeste at all. She was a freedwoman named Charlotte who looked a little like Celeste and wore borrowed clothes and a heavy veil. They had no way of knowing that the real Celeste had never left the parish. Instead, she had moved into the colored section of town, into a small house behind the Freedmen's Church. There, she was welcomed as a sister, an avenger, and the instrument of justice that the law had denied them. And they had no idea that the murders were about to get worse, not better. Eugene Fontenoy died on September 3rd, but not in his bed. He died on the way home from his dry goods store. His throat was cut, and he was found in his wagon at dawn. His horse was peacefully grazing nearby. The way the body was positioned made it look like he had been traveling with someone, a friend, who had waited until they were alone on a dark road before attacking. This was someone he trusted enough to let sit next to him in the dark. The note on his chest said, "Remember the Fontenoy store fire." In November 1869, 3 freedmen tried to open a competing general store in Breaux Bridge. But Fontenoy's store wouldn't give credit to black customers. The new store burned down in less than a week. The 3 men had left the parish with their families, and no one had ever looked into it. Everyone knew who had set the fire. Now, everyone knew how much that knowledge cost. Philip Rousseau, who worked in banking, came next. On September 15, the clerks found him dead in his own bank when they got there in the morning. Apparently, he had been working late on accounts when he was killed at his desk. The cut on his throat was so deep that blood had splattered all over the ledgers he was looking at. The note talked about a loan he had foreclosed on in 1870, which left a freedman farmer homeless and poor. The foreclosure went against the bank's own rules, but it was allowed because the debtor was black. 5 men died in 2 months. The pattern was clear now, not just to the knights, but to everyone in the parish. Someone was methodically killing the most powerful men in street. Martin Parish, men who thought they were safe because of their positions and their brotherhood. And somehow, even with all their safety measures in place, like guards, locked doors, and loaded guns, the killer kept getting to them. The federal government, which had mostly stayed out of local matters since the early days of Reconstruction, now took notice. A U.S. Marshal came from Baton Rouge with orders to look into the murders and see if they were an attack on civilian government that needed military action. Holbrook, the marshal, was a strict man who had fought for the Union and didn't like former Confederates very much. He started his investigation by asking the remaining knights questions. What he found upset him in ways he didn't expect. All of the victims were part of the same group. All of them had been involved in documented violence against freedmen. All of them had been killed in a way that suggested close access and personal revenge. The notes found on the bodies mentioned specific crimes that federal investigators had tried and failed to prosecute because witnesses were scared and local courts were corrupt. Marshal Holbrook talked to dozens of people, both white and black, men and women, people who lived there and people who had just moved there. He looked at crime scenes, read coroner's reports, and studied the pattern of the attacks. Slowly, he put together the story of Celeste Dufresne, the mysterious widow who had seduced and killed at least 3 of the victims, and maybe all 5. But when he looked for her, he found out she was gone. The steamboat manifest showed that a woman who fit her description had left for New Orleans, but the authorities there had no record of her arrival. She had just vanished, as if she had never been there. Then Holbrook did something out of the ordinary. He started talking to people in the freedmen's community, not as suspects, but as possible witnesses. He talked to church leaders, women who ran boarding houses, and men who worked as laborers and craftsmen. He made it clear that he wanted to see justice done, not to protect white criminals. And over time, people started to talk. They told him about Lave Noire, the Black Widow, but none of them said they had seen her in person. They told him about the notes that had gone around the community. They were from someone who knew things that only a free person would know, like the specific crimes that each victim had committed. They told him about Sarah Boudreau's daughter, but no one knew for sure where she was or what she looked like now. And Isaiah, an old freedman who had worked as a carpenter before the war and was now a deacon in the church, told him something that completely changed the marshal's mind about the case. Isaiah said, "You're looking for one woman, one killer. But that's not how it works. Do you really think one person could go around this parish killing white men and not get caught? Do you really think one woman could know everything she needed to know and be in all the right places without help?" Holbrook leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "What I'm saying," Isaiah said carefully, "is that justice is a heavy burden, too heavy for one person to carry alone. I'm saying that when the law fails people, they find other ways, other means. And I'm saying that maybe you should stop looking for a single killer and start asking yourself why no one, not one colored person in this entire parish, has given you any information that would help catch her. Why we all seem to have gone blind and deaf when it comes to Lave Noir. It was the closest anyone would come to admitting the truth that the Freedmen's community was protecting the killer or killers because they thought the murders were not crimes but justice delayed. That what was happening to the Knights was right, needed, and long overdue. Marshal Holbrook was in a situation that was impossible. He could arrest freedmen if he thought they were part of a conspiracy, but that would require military force and would probably lead to the kind of racial violence he had been sent to stop. He could try to get the local courts to prosecute, but those courts were run by the same men he was going after, men who had no moral authority and no credibility with the black community. He could call in federal troops and declare martial law, but that would mean that Louisiana's civilian government had completely failed. He did something that would follow him around for the rest of his career instead. He wrote a report saying that the murders looked like the work of a transient criminal, maybe a woman who called herself Celeste Dufresne. She had since left the area and was now wanted by the federal government. He told the other Knights to be careful, but he also said that without witnesses or physical evidence, it was unlikely that further investigation would lead to any new information. He then went back to Baton Rouge, leaving the parish to take care of itself. Jessup, Thibodeau, Judge Theo, Sheriff Devo, Duplantis, and Arsenault were the only Knights left. They knew that the federal government had left them behind. They were alone, up against an enemy they couldn't see or find, and all they had to protect them was their own resources and fading courage. They made their homes into strongholds. They hired more guards, bought more weapons, and only went out when they had to. They always traveled in groups, never alone and never weak. They looked back on their pasts to see which of their many crimes might have made them targets and which victims' families might have wanted revenge. They waited for the next death, which came sooner than they thought it would. The horror in Street Martin Parish gets worse just when we thought we had seen it all. If this story is making you shiver, send this video to a friend who likes dark mysteries. If you like what we do, please hit the like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Let's find out what happens next, together. William Duplantis died on October 1st, during the day, at his plantation home, which was thought to be safe. 3 armed guards were patrolling the grounds outside while he was alone in his study going over accounts. Someone cut his throat while he was sitting at his desk, and the killer got away through a window that had been unlocked from the inside, which makes it seem like someone had planned the escape ahead of time. The note on his body talked about the Christmas massacre of 1868, when Duplantis led a night raid on a settlement of freedmen, burning homes and killing 5 men who were trying to get people to register to vote. At the time, the federal investigators couldn't prove Duplantis's involvement, even though there were many witnesses. This was because the witnesses had changed their stories after being visited by masked men. Charles Arsenault was next, killed 2 weeks later in the warehouse where he kept his cotton. He and Sheriff Devo and 2 deputies went there to check out a reported break-in. In the chaos of looking for the dark building, Arsenault somehow got separated from the group. Minutes later, they found him with his throat cut and blood pooling on the cotton bales he had collected by making men work for him without paying them fair wages. The note said, "Don't forget the theft you called business. 7 people are dead, 4 people lived, and the other Knights were starting to break down under the stress." Marcus Thibodeau stopped publishing his newspaper, saying he was sick, but really he was hiding out in his house, drinking a lot, and jumping at every sound. Judge Theot moved his family out of the parish completely and started doing business from Baton Rouge. He only went back to Brobridge for court sessions and never stayed the night. Harold Jessup had to close his hotel because he couldn't keep it open when no travelers would stay in a building where several murders had happened. Sheriff Devo was the only one who kept up with his normal schedule. He now traveled with 4 armed deputies at all times and slept in the parish jail instead of his own home. He felt like he had to keep some order as the nominal head of law enforcement, even though he knew he couldn't stop the killings. Everyone else missed the pattern, but Devo saw it. He was going over the dates of the murders and marking them on a calendar when he realized they weren't random. There was a strict schedule for each death, with each one happening exactly 2 weeks after the last one. This made it seem like the killer was planning and controlling the deaths, instead of taking advantage of them. The next death would happen on October 29th if the pattern held. He told the rest of the night's leaders about this. Just himself, Jessup, Thibodeau, and Judge Theot. They met in jail, in a cell with bars on the windows and guards at the door. It was the only place they felt a little safe. Jessup said, "She's playing with us," his voice rough from whiskey and not sleeping. "She wants us to know when it's coming. She's trying to drive us mad with waiting." "Then we use it," Devo said. "We know the date. We get ready. All four of us stay together in a safe place with armed guards. We make ourselves impossible targets. We break the pattern." They came up with a plan. They would meet in the parish courthouse on October 28. The courthouse was built like a fortress, with thick walls and few ways to get in. They would bring food and supplies for a few days and enough armed men to keep the area safe. They would wait until the deadline together, and when November came and no one else died, the killer would lose his psychological edge. It seemed like a good idea, a way to get some control back. They didn't know they were doing exactly what the killer wanted them to do. While the Knights were making plans for their defense, something else was happening in the freedmen's community. Women came together in the church, supposedly for prayer meetings. Men gathered tools and materials that they said they needed to fix buildings. Young people came and went, bringing messages, moving supplies, and making a communication network that white authorities couldn't see. In the little house behind the church, Celeste, if that was still her name, met with a group of people who had been helping her from the start. Marie, the hotel maid, had heard the Knights' plans and told them to her. Charlotte was the woman who pretended to be Celeste on the steamboat. Isaiah, the deacon who had sent Marshal Holbrook's investigation in the wrong direction, was there. And there were others, men and women who had lost family members to the Knights' violence and were still hurting and carrying their own scars. They had been waiting for this moment for years. "They think they're going to hide out in the courthouse," Celeste said. "They think they can wait us out. They don't get that this was never about timing or opportunity. This was always about justice. And justice doesn't stop just because they hide behind walls." She opened up a map of Breaux Bridge and marked places and routes. The courthouse has one weakness they've forgotten about. When they renovated it in 1867, they added a coal chute for the heating system. It runs from the basement to the street, covered by a grate that can be opened from outside. It's barely wide enough for a person, but it's enough. "And once you're inside?" Isaiah asked. "Then I do what I've always done," Celeste said. "I tell them that there are some crimes that the law can't touch and some debts that can only be paid in blood. I also make sure that the last four know exactly why this is happening and whose daughter I am before they die." The meeting went on late into the night, going over the details, giving people their parts, and getting ready for what would be the last act of a 4-year-long performance. Celeste had changed since she got to Breaux Bridge. Madame Dufresne's polished persona had faded away, leaving behind a person who was harder, colder, and shaped by grief and anger into a tool of revenge. But she had also changed in ways she didn't expect. She had made friends with people who had protected her and inspired the community to do more than just get back at her. She had become a symbol, L'Ave Noire, the Black Widow who attacked the power structure that had kept them down for generations. No matter what happened next, whether she lived or died trying to escape, she had already done something very important. She had shown that the Knights were not invincible, that justice could find them even when the law couldn't, and that there were consequences for being cruel, even in a world built to protect the cruel. On October 28, the 4 Knights who were still alive met at the parish courthouse with 8 armed guards. They brought food, water, guns, and lights. They locked up every entrance and posted guards at key points to check windows and doors. Judge Theot looked at the building's structure and saw that the walls were thick and there weren't many ways to get in. Sheriff Devo put his deputies in a circle around the building. He said, "We're as safe here as we'll ever be. Now we wait." The heat and humidity of a Louisiana October came with the night over Breaux Bridge. The courthouse was on a small hill in the middle of town. Its windows glowed with light from lamps, and behind the glass, you could see the shadows of armed men. The town around it was strangely quiet. as if everyone had decided to stay inside and wait for whatever was going to happen without seeing it. People in the colored section got together in small groups and talked in low voices, prayed, and sang hymns that floated through the still air. They were getting ready for something. People who heard the sounds couldn't say exactly what they were, but it felt like the night before a storm, when the air gets thick, the sky turns green, and all the animals know to find shelter. Celeste came out of the house behind the church at midnight. She was now wearing dark, practical clothes that let her move around freely. They were nothing like the fancy dresses Madame Dufresne wore. She had a small bag with the tools she would need. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was set in a determined look that made her look both younger and older than her years. She was a woman who had lost her childhood to violence and had spent her adult life getting ready to answer it. Isaiah walked with her for a while, along with 3 other men who were keeping an eye on things. They stayed away from main streets and took back alleys and yards, following the paths that black people had learned over the years to avoid white people. Isaiah held her arm tightly when they got to the edge of the town square. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. You've shown them they're not above justice. Let that be enough." Celeste looked at him with eyes that showed no mercy, no forgiveness, and no doubt. "My mother died begging them for mercy. Did they show her any? Did they think about whether revenge against her was enough? Or did they take everything? Her husband, her home, her life, her daughter's future? This ends when they're all dead, Isaiah. Not before." She pulled away and moved into the darkness, toward the courthouse that loomed against the night sky like a monument to the very injustice she'd spent 4 years trying to correct. It was surprisingly easy to take off the coal chute grate, as if someone had already loosened the bolts. Celeste slipped through the hole and fell quietly into the basement of the courthouse. The room was dark and full of old furniture and records. The air was thick with coal dust and dust. She waited, letting her eyes adjust, and listened for any sign that someone had seen her come in. Nothing. The guards were all watching the main entrances, which were the most obvious places to get in. No one was thinking about the coal chute, which hadn't been used much since the renovation. She moved quietly through the basement, knowing where the stairs to the first floor were. This was the risky part. The layout of the courthouse didn't have many good hiding spots, and the guards were on the lookout for trouble. But Celeste had some advantages that they didn't see coming. She knew exactly where every squeak in the floorboards was, which hallways had the darkest shadows, and where the guards would be based on standard security procedures because she had talked to Marie and other people who cleaned the building. More importantly, she knew that the knights would be together, probably in the main courtroom or Judge Thiot's chambers, where they would stay together to keep each other safe. There would be guards at the doors, but they probably wouldn't think that someone would attack from inside the building. They thought the threat would come from outside, like a mob of angry freedmen or a direct attack. They weren't ready for someone who was already inside their fortress. She stopped on the first floor and listened to the voices coming from down the hall. Men were talking, people were nervously laughing, and people were trying to convince themselves they were safe. The sound led her to the courtroom, where lamplights shone through the closed doors. Celeste looked in her bag to make sure everything she needed was still there. The knife, which was sharp enough to cut through leather in one stroke. The 4 notes she'd already written, each one about a different crime. The small bottle of chloroform and cloth in case she needed to quietly silence someone. And the photograph, which was wrinkled and faded, that she'd carried for 4 years. It was the only picture she had of her mother, taken by a traveling photographer in 1866, when things were still hopeful, and freedom seemed like the start of a better world, instead of the start of a new kind of hell. She looked at the picture in the dim light that came in through the hallway windows. Her mother smiled at the camera. She was young, beautiful, and full of determination. Sarah Boudreau had faith in the law, in justice, and in the idea that the U.S. government would keep its newly freed citizens safe. She had testified against her attackers, believing that the system would work, but it killed her for that trust. Celeste carefully folded the picture and put it back in the bag. Then she walked up to the doors of the courtroom with her knife ready and her heart steady, even though she knew that what she was about to do would probably kill her. Years ago, she had accepted that could happen. This was never about staying alive. This was about keeping things in balance. making sure that evil didn't go unpunished, and making sure that her mother's death had consequences. She reached for the door handle and found that it was locked from the inside. She had thought this would happen. She went to a window nearby and quietly worked the latch free with her knife. The window opened with a soft creak that sounded like thunder in the quiet building, but it didn't seem to carry to the courtroom. She slipped through the door and into a small clerk's office that was connected to the main room by an interior door. This door was open. She opened it just enough to look inside. The judge's bench was surrounded by the 4 knights, who had their weapons ready. 3 of the guards were near the main doors, and the others were probably patrolling outside. Jessup was drinking from a silver cup. Even though it was cool outside, Thibodeau kept wiping sweat off his face. It looked like Judge Theot was able to focus on his normal work when he read the papers. Sheriff Devo stood by the window and looked out at the dark town. Jessup's voice was slurred as he asked, "How much longer?" 5 hours until dawn, Devo said. Then we're past the deadline. Then we know she can't keep her schedule. Unless she's already in the building, Thibodeau said. And the others looked at him with irritation, born of fear. I'm serious. What if she got in somehow? What if she's waiting for us to let our guard down? Judge Theot said firmly, "The building is safe. We looked at every door and window. The only way in is through the doors, and they're all guarded. We're safe here. We just need to stay disciplined until morning." Celeste thought it was funny how ironic it was. They had looked at every entrance except the one they had forgotten about, the one that servants and people of color used, the one that was out of sight. It was the best way to describe how they saw the world. They only saw what they thought they should see, what fit with what they thought they knew about how the world worked. They had never thought that justice might come from below, through the forgotten channels and invisible people they had spent their whole lives ignoring. She waited, as patient as death itself, watching their routines and making a note of when the guards changed positions, when they stopped paying attention, and when someone turned their back. She said that Jessup's drinking was making him careless, that Thibodeau's fear made him jumpy but also predictable, that the judge's attempt to be normal meant he was focused on his papers instead of what was going on around him, and that the sheriff's watchfulness was directed outward instead of inward. When the guards were getting used to their routine watchfulness and Celeste was starting to feel tired, she made her move. She walked into the courtroom through the clerk's office door and shut it quietly behind her. And just before anyone noticed her, she weighed her options with the cold calculation of someone who had planned for this exact situation. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said in a low voice. Heads turned to look at her. The guards at the doors turned and raised their guns. For a moment, everyone just stared, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Madame Dufresne," Sheriff Devo said at last. "Or should I call you something else?" "My name," Celeste said, "is Josephine Boudreau. I am the daughter of Sarah and Marcus Boudreau, who you murdered in 1868. I have come to collect the debt you owe my family." She said it calmly, without rage or drama, simply stating a fact. At that moment, the other knights knew they had seriously underestimated this woman. She wasn't crazy or hysterical. She was focused, planned, and completely in charge. She had walked into their stronghold, past their guards, and into the middle of their defensive position. She stood in front of them, unarmed and not scared, because she had already won. She had already done what she wanted to do, whether she killed them tonight or not, whether she got away or was caught. She had scared them. She had shown them that justice would find them, even if it took a long time. "Guards," Judge Theot said. "Arrest her. Take her into custody." But the guards didn't move right away. The woman in front of them was so sure of herself and not afraid that they didn't want to go near her. She looked like she could blow up if you touched her, like she could turn into something even more dangerous than she already was. Josephine said, "You can try to take me. You can shoot me, arrest me, or drag me to a cell. But before you do, you should know that I'm not alone. I never have been. Everyone in the colored section of this town knows where you are tonight and what I'm doing. If I don't walk out of this courthouse alive, if I don't give the signal that everything went according to plan, they have orders to burn this building down with all of you inside it." It was a lie. but not a full one. The freedmen's community knew where she was, and they would definitely riot if she died. But Josephine had not given any such orders. In fact, she had told Isaiah to keep everyone away from the courthouse so that she could deal with the consequences of her actions on her own. The Knights, on the other hand, didn't know that. They only knew that there were a lot more people of color than white people in Brobridge, that racial violence could spread quickly, and that they were trapped in a building that could easily become a tomb. Sheriff Devo asked, "What do you want?" Josephine said, "I want you to know why you're going to die. I want you to know that this isn't random violence or crazy criminals. This is justice. It's not perfect, it's late, and it's outside the law because the law let us down, but it's still justice." Then, in a voice that showed no emotion, but was completely sure, she told the story of every crime, every attack, every murder, and every act of terror that these 4 men and their dead friends had done. She named the victims, described what happened, and gave dates and places with the same level of detail as a court document. She had spent 4 years gathering this information, double-checking every detail, and making sure that when this moment came, there could be no denial, no evasion, and no claim of mistaken identity. The Knights listened in horror as she told them everything they had done wrong. Each man had heard about some of the crimes on their own, but when they were all put together and spoken in chronological order, they painted a picture of systematic terror that was almost too cruel to bear. This is what they did. They had made this mountain of pain, death, and destruction, with lives ruined, innocent people killed, and families torn apart. Until now, they had never had to face the consequences of what they had done. "You're confessing," Judge Theod said, trying to get things back under control. "Everything you've just said is a confession to multiple murders. We have witnesses." These guards heard every word. Josephine smiled. "Then arrest me. Put me on trial. Let me testify in court about everything I've just said. Let me call witnesses from the freedmen's community. Let me introduce evidence about every crime these men committed. Let's have a public trial where all of this comes to light. I'm sure the federal authorities in Baton Rouge would be very interested." The judge didn't say anything. Even if she was found guilty, a public trial would ruin them. The scandal would be complete and permanent. There was a real chance that sympathetic northern newspapers would pick up her case, that she would become a cause célèbre, and that the trial would show the whole system of terror that had ruled Louisiana since the end of the war. Devo asked again, "What do you want?" "I want what everyone else wants," Josephine said. "I want justice. But since the law won't give it to me, I'll have to settle for balance. 7 of you are dead, and 4 of you are still alive. I'll make you an offer, but I don't expect you to accept it. You can turn yourselves in to the federal government, confess your crimes in public, face trial and prison, and have your reputations ruined. Or you can refuse and take your chances against me. Those are your only choices." "How about if we arrest you right now?" Jessup asked. "If we hang you tonight and say you attacked us, then you'll have to explain to Marshal Holbrook why you killed a woman without a trial, in secret, in the middle of the night. You'll have to deal with the investigation, the scrutiny, and the questions about why she targeted you specifically. You'll have to take the chance that federal troops will come in and impose martial law. And you'll have to live with the fact that the freedmen's community will eventually get their revenge, one way or another, now or 10 years from now. Is that a risk you want to take?" The standoff went on for a long time, with seconds turning into minutes and the tension building until it felt like the air was vibrating with it. And then, out of the blue, Judge Theod laughed, a tired, bitter sound. "She is right," he said. "We don't have any good choices. We never did. The moment we decided that the law didn't apply to us and started down this path, we guaranteed this ending. Maybe not this exact ending, but something like it. She calls it justice delayed. Maybe she's right. Maybe this is just the bill finally coming due." He stood up and moved slowly, as if all of his years had suddenly caught up with him. "I won't confess. I won't turn myself in. I don't have that kind of courage. But I won't fight you anymore either. I'm done. If you want to kill me, kill me. If you want to let me live in fear for however long I have left, do that. I don't care anymore. I'm just tired." It wasn't exactly giving up. It was more like exhaustion, the feeling of giving up when someone finally realizes they've lost. The other 3 knights looked at him with a mix of anger and jealousy. Anger at his weakness and jealousy at his honesty. Sheriff Devo said, "I'm not ready to die. And I'm not ready to give up." He pulled out his gun and pointed it at Josephine. "You're going to jail for killing 7 men. You'll be tried and hanged. That's how this ends." But before he could move again, before things could get violent, a new sound filled the courthouse. It was a song. There were a lot of voices coming from outside the building. The guards at the windows yelled in alarm. A crowd of freedmen and freedwomen from all over the parish had gathered in the square. They were holding torches and lanterns and singing hymns that had helped them get through slavery, war, and the hard years of rebuilding. They weren't there to fight. They had come to see what happened. To make sure that everyone saw and remembered what happened in the courthouse tonight, and to show that Josephine Boudreau was not alone. They had come to take back the courthouse, which stood for law and justice. They surrounded it with their bodies and voices and refused to stay hidden any longer. Sheriff Devo put down his gun because he knew the situation had gotten out of hand. He couldn't shoot Josephine because it would start a riot. He couldn't take her into custody without going through a crowd of people who saw it happen. He couldn't make her go away without making sure that the story would spread all over the state and that the federal government would have to step in. He knew he had lost. On October 29, dawn broke over Breaux Bridge. The courthouse was still surrounded by freedmen who had stayed there all night. Inside, the fight had ended. Not with violence, but with a strange deal that made everyone unhappy but somehow ended the immediate problem. Josephine Boudreau left the courthouse at dawn. The guards didn't try to stop her, and the crowd parted respectfully to let her through. She had not killed the other knights, even though she was ready to do so. Instead of revenge, she had accepted something more valuable: recognition. Judge Theot had written out a full confession, documenting every crime committed by the Knights of the White Camellia in Street Martin Parish, signed and dated and witnessed by his fellow knights. The document would never be used as evidence in any official proceeding or filed in any court. But it was there, kept by trustees in the freedmen's community, a sword always hanging over the heads of the men who had caused so much pain. Josephine agreed to leave Louisiana and never come back in exchange. She agreed not to kill the other knights, as long as they didn't start terrorizing people again. If they did, the agreement would be void. She agreed to vanish and become a ghost like the mysterious Celeste Dufresne, letting the story become a legend instead of a fact. It wasn't really fair. 3 men who should have been hanged would live out their lives without being punished by the law. They were known as monsters in their community, but their wealth and connections kept them safe. But it was something. It was an admission of guilt, a recognition of crime, and a permanent reminder that their actions had consequences, even when the law turned a blind eye. The 4 knights who lived through that night never got over it. Judge Theot quit his job and moved to Texas, where he died 2 years later from drinking too much and being sad. Sheriff Devo lost his bid for re-election to a group of freedmen and progressive whites who finally had the guts to vote against him. Harold Jessup sold his hotel and moved away from the state. Marcus Thibodeau kept publishing his newspaper, but he never got his power back. His editorials became more and more angry and out of touch with the world around him. That fall, the Ku Klux Klan's power in Street Martin Parish came to an end. The group broke up and disappeared without its leaders and the promise that violence would go unpunished. Reconstruction went on, but it wasn't perfect or complete. But the time of terror that had been going on since the war finally came to an end. And Josephine Boudreau, who had been a tool of revenge for 4 years, vanished from history. Some people said she went to Mexico. Some said she went to Canada. And some said she went to France. The truth was easier to understand and use. She moved to New York, changed her name again, and spent the rest of her life working with groups that fought for the rights of freedmen. She used her experience and intelligence to help others get through the dangerous world of post-war America. She never talked about what happened in Breaux Bridge in public. She never wrote a memoir, gave interviews, or tried to get credit for what she had done. She lived a quiet, simple life until she died in 1903 at the age of 47. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Brooklyn. But in Louisiana, the story of Lauve Noir was passed down from generation to generation in the Bayou Parish's colored communities. It became part of the secret history of Reconstruction, the stories that freedmen told each other about how they resisted and survived, and how regular people fought back against terrible oppression. Over time, the details changed, got more complicated or simpler, and mixed with other stories of revenge and justice. But the main idea stayed the same. A woman whose family was killed by the Klan got revenge by killing the killers and showing that even the most powerful men could face consequences. Historians would later argue about whether Josephine Boudreaux was a real person and if any of the story was true. There were official records of the murders, but they said that an unknown attacker was responsible for them and was never caught or identified. There was never any sign of the confession that Judge Theot signed, but oral histories from the 1932 do mention it. There is no record of Celeste Dufresne in New Orleans, which means she was either made up or used such a deep cover that her real identity couldn't be found. But just because there isn't any proof doesn't mean there isn't any truth. When so much violence was carefully erased from official records, when so many crimes went unpunished and unacknowledged, and when justice for freedmen was only a theory, stories like Lauve Noir were very important. They told people that they could fight back, that the powerful weren't unbeatable, and that courage, planning, and patience could do what the law and the government couldn't. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, in places where memory is stronger than written history, you can still hear an old truth being passed down from grandmother to grandchild, from elder to youth. There are debts that the law can't settle. Courts can't punish some crimes. There are injustices so deep that they need to be addressed outside of civilized society. And when those times come, when people have to choose between putting up with oppression or fighting back with whatever they have, ordinary people sometimes show amazing bravery. 7 men were killed in the summer and fall of 1872. Their throats were cut, and their crimes were finally punished. 4 lived, but they never got better. And in the shadows of history, a woman named Josephine Boudreaux found some peace. She knew that her mother's killer had been punished, and that justice, even though it was not perfect and was bloody and outside the law, had been done. What do you think about this story? Could this really have happened in Louisiana during Reconstruction? Do you think that revenge can ever be as good as justice, or does it just keep the cycle of violence going? Please leave your comment below. I read all of them, and now I want to know what you think. If you got this far, and this story made you feel something, or scared you, or made you think about the hidden costs of history, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Send this video to someone who likes dark, true crime, and old history. These stories are important. We need to listen to these voices.